this evening. Please open your Bibles to the book of Zechariah, chapter 9 this evening, as we continue our discussion of the prophecy of Zechariah, prophesied during the period when the people of Judah were returning from Babylonian captivity. And so we have studied the first 6 chapters talking about the visions which describe the ultimately God's restoring the people to his favor and to his the priesthood and Zerubbabel as the governor and so on, but ultimately symbolic of the coming of Christ and his rule as king and high priest. The last few chapters discuss various prophecies about Judah and the relationship with their enemies. Chapter 7 and 8 had some questions about fasting, and now chapters 9 through 11, we're discussing a section where there's judgments being described on the enemies, but blessings for Judah. Chapter 9, it began talking about the punishment of Syria and Tyre and ultimately the Philistines. But in verse 9 of chapter 9, we discuss the prediction of the coming of the Messiah, the triumphal entry as fulfilled in the New Testament, and all 4 of the gospel accounts describe the coming of Christ and his triumphal entry. That's fulfilled in chapter 9 and verse 9. So from that we concluded that at least much of the context here is referring to the Messianic age. Maybe not all of it, but much of it is. And so as we looked at the following verses, we viewed those in terms of their connection with the New Testament and the coming Messiah, which brought us down through verse 13. We're ready for verse 14 this evening. Questions or comments anybody has through verse 13? I would take up in verse 14 then. Let's go ahead and read the rest of the chapter, and then we'll make further discussion. You'd like to read chapter 9, verse 14 through 17, please. Chapter 9, verse 14 through 17. Steve, please.
Then the Lord will be seen over him, and his hair will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet and go with whirlwinds from the south. The Lord of hosts will defend them. They shall devour and subdue with sling stones. They shall drink and roar as if with wine. They shall be filled with blood like basins, like the corners of the altar. The Lord their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people. They shall be like the jewels of a crown, lifted like a banner over his land. For how great is its goodness, and how great its beauty. Grain shall make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women.
Okay, so we talked about last time the fact that these last several chapters are very difficult. Many believe they're the most difficult chapters in the whole Old Testament to understand. Highly symbolic, and for me, it's difficult at times to know whether it's talking primarily about the people of Judah and their return from Babylonian captivity, or talking primarily about the Messiah and the gospel age. So it's difficult, and sometimes it appears to me that he's switching back and forth from one to the other and then back again. So it's difficult. So we'll do it the best we can with it. But for myself, there'll be times when I'll simply say, well, if you have a better idea, that's fine, because I'm not sure that I can say for certain what some of the material says. We take up in verse 14, and it reverts or relates back, I think, to verse 13 and verse 14. And by the way, we're on question number 21 now. In verse 13, he talked about how Judah was a bow and Ephraim an arrow in the illustration to use against the enemies, and the enemy in particular was Greece. Now, my view of that was that that's still talking about the New Testament, highly symbolic, but discussing spiritual warfare, which the New Testament talks about, Ephesians chapter 6 and 2 Corinthians 10 and so on. And the Greece would represent the errors, the sins of the Gentiles, which the New Testament often warns about, that we should avoid the errors of the Gentiles. So it's talking about, it seems to me, spiritual warfare between God's people in the New Testament, and those who would follow the teaching of the Gentiles, idolatry, and so on. Continuing in verse 14 then, the arrow goes forth like lightning, it says, and the Lord blows a trumpet, and whirlwinds go from the south. So it seems to me this continues this symbol of spiritual warfare between God's people and their spiritual enemies in the New Testament. That seems to me to follow from 13 to 14. Questions or discussion on verse 14? What other views that you had on question number 21? Other comments? Okay. So now we get into verse 15, which, as far as I'm concerned, is even harder. So question number 15, or question number 22, verse 15. What does it say the Lord will do for them, and what will happen as a result? What's the Lord going to do for them in verse 15? Defend them. Okay, that's fairly straightforward. If it's spiritual warfare, he defends his people. We know that's true. He works with us with his armor and so forth. But what's going to happen as a result? As the verse continues, what happens as a result? Frank.
They would devour and subdue with sling stones. I guess as I read this, I thought he was talking about overcoming the oppressors, those that had them captive or were coming against them as captives. In verse 13 it talks about Greece coming, prophesying about Greece coming and overtaking what Assyria and Babylon had conquered in previous years.
Okay, and so it appears to continue the spiritual warfare concept. The Lord's defending them. They devour and subdue with sling stones. Now, some of your translations read different there. But what does that remind you of? Who do you think of in the Bible who overcame with a sling stone? Debbie?
David.
Yeah, that reminds you of David, doesn't it? And maybe that's the symbolism. That as David went to spiritual warfare, or to physical warfare against Goliath, symbolism of our spiritual warfare under the gospel. I guess that would fit too. And the end result is, it says they drink and roar as with wine, and filled with blood like basins, like the corners of the altar. So what does that mean? That's the hardest part for me. Rick's got it.
The only thing I got is, it says it'll drink and roar like with wine. When a person is drinking any alcoholic beverage, sometimes they'll get a false impression of how they can be mean, how they have a mighty power or something. Even though it's a false impression, they believe that.
Okay.
And when it says with wine there, that's the only connection I can make. That they're going to be brave, they're going to be forceful.
Okay. So if it's still talking about this spiritual warfare, it certainly doesn't, as far as I can tell, it doesn't mean that they are drunk, but they have that kind of, they recognize that they're going into warfare, and they go forward with roaring with power. I don't know. Other comments?
To be victorious.
Yes, an attitude of victory. Okay. Convinced they can win. Not that they're really drunk, of course. That's what it means. Other comments? And the blood part of it then would mean what? Frank.
I'm not sure about this, but there's mention of the blood in basins like the blood from sacrifices. And I don't know if the connection is talking about the sacrifices to their idols. I don't know who's talking about, or who's being talked about here.
Okay. Other comments? What does the blood of the corners of the altar have to do with it? Susie?
Well, weren't there basins or bowls on the sacrificial altar that when the priests offered sacrifices on the altar that collected blood?
Okay, so if I understood what you said, that's the blood flowing from the sacrifices on the altar. Okay, and so that blood in the warfare, symbolically, obviously, in this spiritual warfare, there's going to be spiritual flowing of blood, not physical. But just like blood flowing in the altar and the sacrifices, there's going to be conflict, which is going to lead to spiritual defeat and enemies. Debbie?
I saw this as a return to worship that they hadn't had for a while.
Okay, so no more talking about warfare, but now that it's really talking about their worship. Is that what you're saying?
That's what, yeah, I thought.
Okay. Okay. Other comments? It would certainly be a switch in the direction of it, but it would. All right, or maybe that's what's motivating them. Okay. Yeah. They're motivated and they're standing for the truth by their worship. Okay? I'm not going to argue because I don't know for sure. Other comments? Okay. All right, so they're in this, up to this point at least, they're in this conflict. The Lord's going to defend them. They're going to be victorious to subdue their enemies. And verse 16, as we continue then, what else is the Lord going to do for them? Question 23, what else is the Lord going to do for them? According to verse 16. Bill?
He's going to save them in that day.
Save them as the flock of his people, it says. And what does he compare it to? First, it's got several.
Jewels of a crown.
Okay, jewels of a crown. In fact, there's three comparisons, and I ask you to look at those three, question number 23. The first one is jewels of a crown, and then what else? What are his other comparisons?
He lifted like a banner over his land.
A banner over his land, and the first one was a flock of his people. Okay, so you've got three comparisons there that the Lord is comparing them to in his saving his people. They're going to be in this warfare. There's a spiritual danger, as you would expect, but God is with his people. He's going to defend them. Verse 15, and he's going to save them. Verse 16. So what are the illustrations? The flock of his people, what's the point of that illustration? If he saves them as the flock of his people, what's the point of that illustration? Steve?
God is their shepherd.
All right. And so we have the shepherd illustration, like we often have with regard as God is our shepherd, or the Lord is our shepherd. He's the good shepherd, John chapter 10. The Lord is our shepherd, Psalm 23, and so on. So the illustration, we're his flock, he's the shepherd, so he's going to save us, defend us, as a shepherd would his flock. Okay, other comments on the flock idea?
Well, you take verse 14, 15, and 16. 14 starts out, then the Lord will be seen over them. 15 starts out, the Lord of hosts will defend them. 16 starts out, the Lord their God will save them in that day. He is their leader. He is the shepherd.
Very good. And there's that day expression too, isn't there? In verse 16. Okay, so he is a shepherd, saving his flock. How about the crown illustration? What's the significance of that? Steve?
Precious and of great value.
All right. So the crown, he's the king, but his people are illustrates the jewels in that crown the value that he places upon them. He's ruling over his people, but he values them. They are like jewels in his crown, precious. Okay? Other comments on the jewels of the crown? And obviously highly symbolic. Susie?
Well, Malachi 3, verse 17, they shall be mine, says the Lord of hosts, and on the day that I make them my jewels, on that day, and I will spare them, as a man spares his own son who serves him.
Okay, what was that?
Malachi 3:17.
Okay, all right. Other comments on the idea of the jewels of the crown? So he's like a shepherd, saving them. He values them like the jewels of a crown. And what else does he? And the banner. What is that illustration? Some of your translations may say something different. What's the illustration of the banner? Karen.
A banner tells you, identifies who these people are.
Okay. So a banner identifies his people. What else does a banner do? Other comments on a banner? Susie.
It shows their allegiance and a declaration. It's not just, okay, this is who we are. This is who we are. And,
Okay.
And oftentimes then it shows victory too.
Shows what?
Victory.
Victory. So in a lot of times it would be like, again, back to the illustration of the war. The army would have a banner identifying who they are, but it shows who they're committed to, who they recognize as their leader and their source of guidance, who they're fighting for, so to speak. All right, so in that sense, in that same way, then in this spiritual battle, God's people identify with him, and they're carried as a banner that they're his people. He's their king. They're his jewels in his crown, and they are his army, his soldiers, his people. Other comments on verse 16. Susie.
In Isaiah chapter 11, verses 10 through 12, it describes the Messiah as a banner or an ensign. But he also says he will set a banner up for the nations, and he will assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth.
Which is also a prophecy of the New Testament, the Messianic kingdom. Okay? So that's another passage where the banner is used to refer to God's people under the New Testament. Other comments on verse 16? Okay, that one was a little more straightforward, wasn't it? Okay? And then verse 17, as he closes the chapter, what is it? Question number 24. How is their victory described in verse 17? God's care for them and the ultimate outcome. Verse 17. Great. Great in what way? Great in goodness. Great in beauty. Okay? And the grain and the new wine symbolizes what? Susie?
Prosperity, abundance.
Okay, prosperity. Remember we talked about the times before. Go back to Haggai and so on. God would not allow them to have abundant crops because of their disobedience. The harvests were not good, and the grain and the wine, and he doesn't mention it here, but the olives, the oil, those are the three things that are often mentioned to illustrate if he's not going to let them prosper, then they don't have those things. If they're going to prosper, they're going to have those things. So it's prosperity. Again, spiritual, it seems to me like the blessings that God would provide for them, goodness, beauty, prosperity, again, always symbolizing his relationship to them and their relationship with him, that things are as they should be between these people and those blessing them. All right, other comments on 17. Terry.
In Psalms 31 and verse 19, the same thoughts are expressed when it says, "Oh, how abundant is your goodness, which you have stored up for those who fear you and work for those who take refuge in you in the sight of the children of mankind." So
Okay.
all men are going to be able to see this blessing that God is bestowing on his people.
Okay? All right, so in the outcome then of this spiritual battle, God, as Rick pointed out, God sees over them and he defends them and he saves them. The outcome then is great blessings to God's people. And if this is still spiritual, it talks about the New Testament, as would be for us today. And we should then appreciate the fact that God is with us if we're his faithful people. This king is leading us. We're his followers. We are precious to him, like jewels in his crown. We're his flock, his sheep. He's guarding us and guiding us like a shepherd, caring for us and ultimately providing for us. Okay. Other comments through chapter 9, anybody? Okay. We come to chapter 10. And now, I mentioned earlier, it appears to me that sometimes Zechariah goes back and forth from talking about Judah and their literal return from captivity, and other times he's talking about as a prophecy of the Messianic age. And sometimes it's not easy for me to tell which is which. But somewhere along here, either at the beginning or somewhere in chapter 10, I'm convinced he's going back to literal Judah, maybe symbolically of the Messianic age. But some of these things, I have a very difficult time viewing them as talking about the Messianic age, especially as it comes on into chapter 11. So we'll do what we can, but it's not always easy for me to know which he's talking about. So we'll go ahead and proceed and see what happens. Who'd like to read now? Chapter 10. Let's read the first 5 verses. Chapter 10, verses 1 through 5. Who'd like to read that, please? Chapter 10, verses 1 through 5 for us, please. Bill, chapter 10, verses 1 through 5.
Ask the Lord for rain and the time of the latter rain. The Lord will make flashing clouds. He will give them showers of rain, grass in the field for everyone. For the idle speak delusion, the diviners envision lies, and tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. Therefore the people win like their way like the sheep. They are in trouble because there is no shepherd. My anger is kindled against the shepherds, but I will punish the goatherds. For the Lord of hosts will visit his flocks, the house of Judah, and will make them as his royal horse in the battle. For him comes the cornerstone, from him the pentag, from him the battle bow, from him ever grower together. They shall be like mighty men who tread down their enemies. In the mire of the streets in the battle, they shall fight because the Lord is with them, and all the riders on horses shall be put to shame.
Okay. So, as we go into chapter 10, verse 1, question number 1, what does God promise for his people? Verse 1, what's he promised to do? And chapter 9 ended with them, the prosperity of their crops or harvest. How does chapter 10, verse 1 promise? Bill.
It's going to give them showers of rain.
Rain. In the time of latter rain. So if they ask for rain, he's going to give them rain. Flashing clouds, showers of rain. And the result will be grass in the field for everyone. What is the significance of the latter rain? The latter rain means what? Rick?
As far as I got, it's the seasonal rains. It was the rains that they had expected for their planting season.
Okay. In fact, that's an expression that's a number of times used in Scripture, the early and the latter rain. So they needed rain when they first planted to cause the crops to begin to grow, but they needed rain later on to help the crops to continue to grow and come to complete to where they're ready for the harvest of crops. So God said He's going to give what they need for their crops, showers and grass and so forth. Again, symbolic of His blessings to them. He's going to provide for them. Other comments on verse 1? Okay, again, that could be spiritual in the New Testament, or it could be physical, or in Judah itself, or maybe this physical is symbolic of the spiritual. Could be. Other comments? All right, verse 2 discusses now the negative. What is it that they need to avoid in verse 2? And we have a special question, assignment question number 2. What's he talking about, and what are the consequences that come from what he discusses? Terry.
He's talking about the false gods and the false prophet professions of those people that oversee the gods, and that they would bring delusion and lies and false dreams. No comfort would come from them, and only trouble.
All right. So he returns to a subject we've seen mentioned many, many times in the prophets, the problem of idolatry. Now, when they came back from captivity, they had eliminated their idols. So he's either talking about the problems they had before, reminding them of the problems they had before, or maybe talking about the nations around them, the problems they had. So what they had, the idols, they were guided by diviners. So I ask you what divine meant. Question number 3. What is a diviner? What is divining? Steve.
Foretelling the future. Foretelling the future.
Foretelling the future. How? By God? Prophecy? No. It's by an occult means. By astrology and witchcraft and those kind of things. That's what he's talking about. So he says they envision lies. It's not truly from God. It's not the power of God. It's from the idols associated with idolatry. Okay? So what results from that is, it continues in verse 2. They've got these false guides who tell them that they're predicting the future and giving them guidance, but it's coming from the idols rather than from the true God. So what happens as a result? The last part of verse 2. What does it result in? Terry.
Well, it leaves them like sheep without a shepherd. They're lost and wandering about with no direction.
Okay. They don't have real guidance because it's not from God. So like shepherds, a sheep without a shepherd. They're wandering. They may think they know where they're going, but they don't, because the guidance that they're receiving is false guidance. So that's what happens with idolatry. It certainly would have happened under the Old Testament. And so he's reminding them of that problem. It still is happening in the nations around them. And I'm not sure, but I wonder if that's not what he's talking about. Not that Judah is doing this now. They seem to have been cured of that, but the nations around them are still doing it, and so they need to be warned to watch out for it and to guard against it. But do you have other comments on verse 2? Other thoughts on this warning about idolatry and false guides? Okay, so verse 3 then. Well, let's see if we covered everything. Okay, verse 3. How does God view these shepherds? And what's he going to do about it? Verse 3. Carry on.
He's angry with them and will punish them.
All right, he's angry. His anger is kindled against these shepherds and he's going to punish them. Goat herds, sheep herds, goat herds. But what's he going to do for his people? So that's why it seemed to me like the shepherds and goatherds, he's talking about other nations, other people. What's he going to do for his people? Last part of verse 3. Susie.
Said that the Lord would visit his flock or have mercy and compassion on them.
Okay. So in contrast to the peoples that are following the idols and their false visions, his anger is against them, but his flock he will visit, the house of Judah, make them as his royal horse in battle. So again, the symbolism of battle, remember the overall theme here is that here's the enemies that God is going to judge, but here's his blessings on his people, warnings to do right, but his blessings on his people in contrast to the enemies. So the enemies, he's upset with their leaders, spiritual leaders, but his flock, the house of Judah, he's going to visit them and make them as his royal horse in battle, as though they are his, with him, working on his army, his people. Okay? Other comments to verse 3. Terry.
I wondered if the thought here might include the idea that God was angry with the leaders and that he was going to take over. He was going to visit his people and he was going to lead them and make them what he wanted them to be, but he was going to punish the shepherds and those that had led them astray to begin with. Like back in Jeremiah, this is where I got that again. Back in Jeremiah chapter 15, in verse 6, it says, "My people have been lost sheep. Their shepherds have led them astray, turning them away on the mountains. From mountain to hill they have gone. They have forgotten their fold. And all who found them have devoured them, and their enemies have said, we are not guilty, for they have sinned against the Lord, their habitation of righteousness, the Lord, the hope of their God."
So that would be the leaders before they went into captivity.
Right.
So instead of, as I was saying, the leaders of other nations, it would be the leaders even of Judah, but before they went into captivity, reminding them of the problem that caused them to go into captivity. Those leaders misled them, reminding them now not to follow those kind of leaders now.
Right.
Okay, now that's another definite possibility. Okay? The lesson's the same either way. Okay, other comments? Okay? So the Lord is angered against the shepherds who led people astray, but he's going to take care of his people. Now, verse 4, and question number 7. What illustration does God use in verse 4 to describe what's going to come from God? What comes from God in verse 4? Frank.
The illustration is one is a cornerstone, and then a tent peg, and a battle bow, and then from him every ruler together. I see, like in the first two, the cornerstone and the tent peg, steadfastness and stability. As he leads them in the way they should go, in the truth.
Okay, so cornerstones in Scripture refer to what in general? We see this many times. What does a cornerstone do?
Squares.
Rick? Excuse me.
It's the main building block that's first laid, so the rest of the building can be built around it.
Okay, so it's a fundamental part of the foundation. Everything else is built on, which go along with Frank's idea of security, strength. I thought I heard another comment. Did I hear another comment?
Squares.
Susie?
Squares.
All right, a square built properly in relationship to that cornerstone. Okay. And then you have, and similar, the tent peg. What's a tent peg do? Now, we don't have much, we don't live in tents like they did so much, but a tent peg does what, Terry?
It holds everything in place, keeps it where it's been planted or put down, so that it doesn't wander or stray like the sheep on the mountain.
Okay, so now you're talking about, so it has a foundation, it has security, strength, to stand firm, not be blown away. Okay? And what else then comes from God? Then the battle bow, what is that? Significance. The battle bow would represent what if God gives that to them? Terry? Security, protection. Again, all these are symbols, obviously, but God is providing for them what they need for foundation, for strength, for security. And so, in contrast to those idols and those false gods who couldn't give security, couldn't give proper guidance, God provides what they do need to be strong and have security, protection from their enemies. Okay? And then every ruler together. What's the significance here? He provides the rulers. Terry?
Rulers together give you the idea of unity, that everybody's of the same mind.
I'm sorry?
Rulers together gives the idea of unity. Everybody is of the same mind.
Okay, rulers who work together. So you have guidance. Again, in contrast to those idols with their diviners, their false guidance. Now you have true guidance, and they work together. That's a good point. That rather than wandering around like the sheep without the shepherd, verse 2, God gives them rulers who work together and give them proper guidance. So he's protecting them, he's giving them security, he's giving them strength, victory, and everything that they would not have when they followed the idols. Okay? Susie?
Do you think that the cornerstone has reference to a messianic reference, as in Isaiah 28:16?
Okay, and fulfilled in Christ in the New Testament.
It was a question. Do you think that?
I'm just adding to the evidence for 1 Peter chapter 2. So again, yes, could be. It certainly would fit, wouldn't it? All these things that he's describing would spiritually be true under the New Testament. So it could be that either this is talking about Judah and the Old Testament, symbolically of the New Testament. Like I said, I'm not sure, but that would certainly fit, wouldn't it? Other comments, Terry?
The idea of, from question number 6, about he would make them into like a majestic steed. Literal Israel or Judah never gained that kind of presence in the world again. That they, after they came back from Babylon, they just continued to be conquered. They were never rulers of their own land again, were they?
Okay, I'm sorry, you said something at the beginning of a particular reference you had?
From question 6, where it talks about the majestic steed, verse 3, the idea that whatever God's going to do with this group seems to be something. The idea is there of something more than the physical Israel, isn't it? Because they never attained that self-rule again, or world leadership, or any major. They were always in controlled by somebody else. But when Christ came, his kingdom was going to become that majestic thing, that ruling power that nothing else could shake.
See, that's part of my problem with taking this physically here too, is at times, because it doesn't seem to fit that they never had that kind of dominance over their enemies that's described here. So sometimes it seems to me it has to be spiritual. But, as I said, it's not going to be too long. We're going to find some things that I just don't see how it can be taken spiritually. So it seems to me like sometimes it goes back and forth. And that's part of my problem with it. But that is definitely a point, Terry, that I thought about too. So the victory, if it's Judah's literal victory over their enemies, I don't remember any time when they did that after they returned from captivity. The enemies didn't defeat them. Well, that's not true either, did they? Because you had problems with the Seleucids and so on. So, okay. Other comments? Okay, let's go ahead and finish verse 5. I see Rick standing up. He's getting ready to punch a button back there. Verse 5, this goes along with what Terry was just saying. What are they going to do according to verse 5? What will they be like? Verse 5, and we're in question number 8 now. Karen?
Like mighty men who tread down their enemies.
All right, mighty men treading down their enemies, and admire the streets in the battle and fight because the Lord is with them, and the riders on horses shall be put to shame. So they're going to defeat their enemies. Well, did they ever do that unto the people of Judah, literally? Spiritually, God is with his people. But Judah, I don't know. Other comments? If it refers to the New Testament and our spiritual warfare, what should we learn from it? And that's going to be the application in any case. What's the lesson to us? Susie?
It's a total, through God, there's total defeat, and Christ's suffering, death on the cross, there's total defeat of sin. It's complete.
And ultimate victory for Christ and his people. That's the book of Revelation. Christ is going to be the winner. The battle is going to go to the Lord. He's going to be victorious, and those who are on his side are going to be victorious. Satan and his demons, his followers, are going to be defeated. They're going to be the losers. So, however this actually applies in chapter 10 here, ultimately the lesson for us is if we are God's people, we will be the victors. Sometimes I wonder if we feel that way, if we see ourselves that way, if we're not fearful of our spiritual enemies around us, me too, in ways in which we need to realize God is with us if we're with him, and will give us strength and courage as is being described here. Other comments through verse 5 before we close? Okay, thank you. We'll take up in verse 6 then next time. Thank you.